Hello everyone. Let's begin with the first chapter of Plus One from the book Hornbill. The first chapter, The Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh. Now, before beginning, let's read a little about the author, Khushwant Singh. Khushwant Singh. So, he was born on 2nd February 1915 and he was named as Kushal Singh. So, this was his original name and he died on 20th March 2014. He was an Indian author, lawyer, diplomat, journalist, and politician. His experience in the 1947 partition of India inspired him to write Train to Pakistan in 1956, which was made into a film in 1998, which became his most well known novel. So, this is in brief about Khushwant Singh. Now, let's begin with the chapter. We are starting from page 3. The first line. In the first line, the author describes his grandmother like everybody's grandmother. So, here in this line, when he is describing his grandmother, he doesn't portray his grandmother as someone unique. He says that his grandmother was like everybody's grandmother. Everybody can relate to the author's grandmother. So, when we take the first question, what was hard to believe for the author? So, as he writes about his grandmother, he says the fact that his grandmother had once been young and pretty and had even a husband, as told by people, was hard to believe for him because the author had always known or seen her like that. So, what is that? Old and wrinkled for past 20 years. So, in the beginning, the author says that he had always seen his grandmother old and wrinkled. She had been like that for past 20 years. So, therefore, whenever somebody described his grandmother as once being young and pretty, or even talked about her husband, so this fact was hard to believe for the author. So, as he moves on, then he describes his grandfather. Now, he has not met or seen his grandfather in person. He talks about his grandfather as he sees his portrait hanging on the wall. So, what does the author say about his grandfather? Or why did Khushwant Singh feel that his grandfather couldn't have had a wife or children? So, the portrait of Khushwant Singh's grandfather hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. The author describes him as an old man wearing a big turban and loose fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. He did not look like a person who would have a wife or children. He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. Now he feels the same for his grandfather too. So both of them, they were so old, and the author had seen them like that for past many years. Therefore, he had a feeling that they were never young. So maybe the author's grandfather had died before he was grown up enough to remember him, or perhaps even before that, and therefore he had only seen his portrait in which he looked to be 100 years old. So therefore it is hard to believe for the author. सो ऑथर को ये लगता है कि उसकी जो ग्रैंड मदर है और ग्रैंड फादर है वो हमेशा से ही ऐसे थे, वेरी ओल्ड. सो फॉर ग्रैंड मदर ही इट इज़ हार्ड टू बिलीव दैट ग्रैंड मदर जो है वो कभी जवान और प्रिटी थी. नाउ लेट मूव ऑन. नेक्स्ट ही सेज the thought was almost revolting for Khushwant Singh. So, what thought was revolting? Why didn't the author believe that his grandmother, what his grandmother told him about her childhood, or which stories of grandmother were treated as fables of the prophets by the author, and why? सो अब जब ग्रैंड मदर जो है वो ऑथर को स्टोरी सुनाती थी अपने चाइल्डहुड की, सो दैट थॉट वाज ऑलमोस्ट रिवोल्टिंग फॉर खुशवंत सिंह. नाउ व्हाई? अगेन इट्स द सेम रीजन. सो लेट्स रीड. सो इट रेज्ड डाउट इन द माइंड of the author that his grandmother had once been young and pretty. So जैसे कि हमने पहले पढ़ा है, so there were doubts in the mind of the author कि कभी grandmother एक छोटी बच्ची भी थी कभी वो जवान भी थी. So this thought was almost revolting for him. So when his grandmother told him about the games she used to play as a child, it was beyond his wisdom to imagine his grandmother as a child playing all those games. तो जब वो grandmother बताती थी अपने बचपन के बारे में कि हम बचपन में ऐसी games खेलते थे, so the author could not imagine grandmother being a child and jumping around like that. So that seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, and we treated it like fables of the prophets she used to tell us. So this line I've taken from the chapter. So all the children who were sitting around and grandmother used to tell them about her childhood. So those children, they could not imagine grandmother as a child playing those games. So they thought that grandmother was telling them stories like other stories of prophets that grandmother used to tell them. So the grandmother once being a child and playing those games seemed implausible to him. Implausible to him means they could not imagine. It was impossible for them. The idea of grandmother behaving like a child, running and jumping like children do, didn't befit her. Thus, the author treated her narrations of her childhood like any other story or fables of the prophets told by her. So, वो सब कहानियाँ ही लगती थी author को. So, the grandmother playing. So, all this was a story to the author. Now, on page 4, now he describes his grandmother. So, why did the author call his grandmother the winter landscape, or describe the author's grandmother, or whom does the author call an expanse of pure white serenity, and why? So, the author's grandmother was short, fat, and slightly bent. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. So, slightly she was bent, she was old and fat, and her face was crisscross of wrinkles. So you can see here crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. The author couldn't get himself to believe that his grandmother could have been young or pretty. So again, he couldn't believe or imagine that his grandmother once was young or pretty. He had always seen her that way, so terribly old that she couldn't get older than that. So grandmother was so old that author could not imagine her getting even older. But according to the author, she was beautiful. Calm and composed, she would hobble about the house in spotless white. So, grandmother हमेशा pure white clothes पहनती थी. So, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop. Now, you can see in the picture here, and the other telling the beads of her rosary. So, माला साथ साथ जपती थी. Her silver locks, they were scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face, and her lips always moved in inaudible prayer. Her poised presence seemed to the author like a winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. So she was always so quiet, always her lips they were moving in prayers, and there was a pure serenity and calm composure on her face. So she looked like a winter landscape in the mountains. So she was in the winter of her age actually. So it refers to her aura, calm, peaceful, and serene disposition of the grandmother. So, what was the morning routine of the author and his grandmother in the village? Why did the author listen to grandmother's morning prayers when he didn't bother to learn it? So, now as he is describing his grandmother, now he is telling us about his childhood. So, he had spent his childhood days with his grandmother in the village. So, what was his routine there? So the author was living with his grandmother in his village when his parents went to city for better future prospects. So उसके जो parents थे उन्होंने उसको grandmother के पास छोड़ा in the village, and they themselves went to city for a better job maybe. So there the author and his grandmother, they were constantly together. So village में दोनों हमेशा साथ रहते थे. She used to wake him up in the morning and get him ready for school. While bathing him, she used to say her morning prayer in a monotonous sing-song, hoping that the author would listen and comprehend. So जो ऑथर की ग्रैंड मदर है वो उसे सुबह उठाती थी, नहलाती थी और तैयार करती थी स्कूल के लिए, और साथ साथ वो प्रेयर्स जो है वो गुनगुनाती थी. सो शी यूज्ड टू डू दैट, hoping कि author जो है वो prayer सुनेगा और उसे वो याद हो जाएंगी, and then he would also repeat that. But the author did not listen to her prayer, not to learn it. Sorry, the author did listen. So author जो है वो prayer सुनता ज़रूर था, but not to learn it, but because he loved her voice. So she would then bring his wooden slate washed and plastered with yellow chalk. So these kinds of slates. So she would bring she used to wash it and plaster it with yellow chalk. Then she would bring a tiny earthen ink pot. This is the tiny earthen ink pot and red pen, tie them in a bundle and hand it to them. So this is also a kind of slate. Then after a breakfast of thick stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it, they went to school. His grandmother used to carry stale chapatis with her for village talks. So this was the routine. So grandmother and the author, they were together. दोनों साथ रहते थे village में. Grandmother उसका हर काम करती थी, उसे उठाती थी सुबह, then school के लिए तैयार करती थी, and she even used to go with him to school. Now why she used to go with him to school? Let's read that. So why did grandmother go to school with author? And then what would they do on their way back to school? Now, in case you get a question about their routine, so this 5A and 5B, these are also going to be included in that routine. I have just separated it because in case only this question comes. So if it is only asked that why did grandmother go to school with the author, then this is the answer. But you will include these two questions too in the routine. So grandmother always went to school with the author because the school was attached to a temple. So simple reason, क्योंकि school जो है वो temple के बिल्कुल साथ था, so इसलिए grandmother जो है वो author के साथ school जाती थी. So students, they used to sit in veranda in rows like this on either side, and the priest would teach them the alphabet and the morning prayer. While the children, they sang the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus, grandmother would sit inside the temple reading the scriptures. So while the author was studying in the school, grandmother used to sit inside the temple and read the scriptures. Then what would they do on their way back to school? So then the author tells us that what was their routine back home. So when the author and his grandmother had both finished with the school and reading the scriptures in the temple respectively, then they would walk back together. Now this time the village dogs, they would meet them at the temple door and they followed them to their home, growling and fighting with each other for the chapatis they threw to them. So since grandmother carried stale chapatis, जो बासी रोटियां होती है, सो ग्रैंड मदर वो अपने साथ लेके जाती थी और वापसी पे जो स्ट्रीट डॉग्स है, वहाँ के जो विलेज डॉग्स हैं, उनको वो चपातीस देते थे. सो द डॉग्स, दे यूज्ड टू फॉलो देम and they used to give them chapati. So this was their routine in the village. So every day both of them, they were together, they spent their time together. Mostly throughout the day, both grandmother and grandson, they were together. But then there came a turning point in their friendship. So what was that turning point? So the turning point in the author's life was also a turning point in their relationship discussed. This is an important question. Now when the author's parents, they were comfortably settled in the city, they called both the author and the grandmother to the city. So उन्होंने दोनों को city बुला लिया. Now this proved to be the turning point in their life. The author mingled in the fast pace of the city, whereas grandmother withdrew herself into isolation. So city में आके author तो फटाफट जो city life में busy हो गया, लेकिन जो grandmother है, she withdrew herself into isolation because grandmother didn't have anything to do there. So now they didn't have any time to spend together. Though they shared the same room, the grandmother did not accompany the author to school or help him in his homework or talk about his lessons at school. So सिटी में आके तो एक ही कमरे में दोनों रहते थे, लेकिन फिर भी ग्रैंडमदर जो है वो अब उसके साथ उतना टाइम स्पेंड नहीं कर पाती थी because he went to an English school, so grandmother वहाँ नहीं जा सकती थी. And since he was now studying in a new school where the subjects, they were different, grandmother was not able to help him with his studies too. So she was not happy as no religious teachings were given at the school to the author. So since he went to a city school where no religious teachings were given, so grandmother was not happy. She didn't even approve of the music lessons that the author started taking at school. Then, when the author went to university, he was given a room of his own. So, like this, even the common link that was the room between them two was snapped. So, when the author grew up and he joined university, he was given a room of his own. So, that common link between the two, the common link was the room that they shared. So, even that room, the common link was snapped. So, this was the turning point in the friendship. So then what happened? Now, which announcement of the author disturbed the grandmother and how did she react to it? So one day what happened, author came back from school and he announced that they were being given music lessons at school. Now grandmother, she was a conservative lady, so she was very disturbed to hear this because for her music had lured. Lured means indecent associations. It was a monopoly of harlots and beggars and not meant for gentle folk. So she believed that music was monopoly of harlots. Harlots means those who are characterless, so and beggars, and it wasn't meant for people of good families. So grandmother did not like this, but she did not show her dislike for this. She just kept silent. But after this they did not talk, so she rarely talked to the author after this. Her silence meant disapproval. So like this, the gap between the two, it kept on increasing. So communication gap kept on increasing between the grandmother and the grandson. Then what happened? So what was the common link of friendship between the author and his grandmother and how was it snapped? How did she react to it? So this we have done. We'll just be doing this last part. How did she react to it? So the common link of friendship between the author and his grandmother was the room that they shared. But when the author went up to university, he was given a separate room which snapped that common link between the two. The grandmother accepted that separation. The separation is isolation and loneliness with passivity. Passivity means resignation. So she just became quiet and did not talk to anyone after that. So she stopped talking to anyone, and from sunrise to sunset, she sat by her wheel spinning and reciting prayers. So grandmother ने अपने आप को अकेले आइसोलेट कर लिया और सारा दिन व्हील स्पिनिंग और रिसाइटिंग प्रेयर्स जो है उसमें लग गई. So the only time that she relaxed for a while in the afternoon was while feeding the sparrows, and she started feeding the sparrows. So वो एक टाइम था आफ्टरनून का जब वो स्पैरोज के साथ टाइम स्पेंड करती थी when she relaxed. Otherwise throughout the day वो व्हील पे होती थी और प्रेयर करती थी. So this is spinning the wheel and feeding the sparrows. Now, which was the happiest half an hour of the day for the grandmother? So the half an hour of the day in the afternoon when she sat in the veranda to feed the sparrows, that was the happiest time for grandmother. She would break the bread into little bits for hundreds of little birds that collected round her and created a noisy chaos on the veranda. So noisy chaos is a veritable bedlam of chirping. So some came and perched on her legs, others on her shoulders, some even sat on her head. She smiled but never shooed them again. So वो जो आधा घंटा है जो कि ग्रैंड मदर स्पैरोज के साथ स्पेंड करती थी वो सारे दिन का हैप्पीएस्ट मोमेंट होता था ग्रैंड मदर के लिए. सो स्पैरोज दे यूज्ड टू कम, दे यूज्ड टू सराउंड हर, उसके आसपास आ जाती थी हंड्रेड्स ऑफ स्पैरोज. कोई उसके सर पे बैठती, कोई शोल्डर्स पे, कोई लेग्स पे, बट ग्रैंड मदर नेवर शूट देम अगेन. Then what was the reaction of the grandmother? Uh, what reaction of the grandmother had the author expected when he decided to go abroad? So did grandmother behave as expected? Or how was grandmother's reaction contrary to the belief of the author? So अब यूनिवर्सिटी के बाद ऑथर ने डिसाइड किया कि वो अपनी हायर स्टडीज़ के लिए अब्रॉड जाएगा. सो अब इस न्यूज़ को ग्रैंड मदर ने कैसे रिएक्ट किया और ऑथर ने क्या एक्सपेक्ट किया था कि ग्रैंड मदर कैसे रिएक्ट करेगी, पर ग्रैंड मदर ने कैसे रिएक्ट किया? So that is the question. Now when the author decided to go abroad for higher studies, he was sure that his grandmother would be upset as he was going to be away for 5 years. So author ने expect किया था कि grandmother को बिल्कुल अच्छा नहीं लगेगा क्योंकि वो 5 साल के लिए जाने वाला था. But contrary to his belief, she was not even sentimental. लेकिन ग्रैंडमदर ने कोई भी इमोशन नहीं दिखाया. So she went to see off the author at the railway station but didn't show any emotion. Her lips moved in prayer. Her mind was lost in prayer. So वो सारा टाइम प्रेयर कर रही थी. उनका माइंड जो है वो भी प्रेयर में डूबा हुआ था. So her fingers, they were busy telling the beads of her rosary. Bidding him goodbye, she silently kissed the author's forehead. So she was silent, she was quiet and praying all the time. Maybe she was praying for good health and good journey of the author. So she just kissed the author's forehead and said goodbye. Now, what did the grandmother do at the return of the author? Or what change came over her in the evening? Or how did the grandmother celebrate the author's homecoming? So, now after 5 years, the author came back. So, what did the grandmother do then? Now, after 5 years, when the author returned, the grandmother was there to receive him at the railway station. So, grandmother again went to receive the author. She didn't look a day older to the author, so she was again the same for the author. She didn't say anything, just clasped the author in her arms. So she just hugged the author. That day too, she didn't miss feeding the sparrows, and those still seemed to be the happiest moments. So even on that day, the grandmother didn't miss feeding the sparrows, and that moment was the happiest one. But in the evening, there was a change in grandmother. So, what changed? She collected all the women of the neighborhood, got an old drum, and she started to sing and celebrate the author's homecoming. So, there was celebration time in the house. She continued to sing for hours together. The family had to persuade her to stop to avoid getting sick. So that day was an unusual day for her, as for the first time she had not prayed. So something unusual also happened on that day. जो grandmother है, first time उन्होंने अपनी prayers miss की. So that was the unusual thing that happened and the change that came over her in the evening. Now on page 6. So अब जो ऑथर है वो यूनिवर्सिटी के बाद अब्रॉड जाता है एंड देन ही कम्स बैक. ग्रैंडमदर सेलिब्रेट करते हैं बट उसके बाद क्या होता है? सो व्हाट डिड द फैमिली फेयर फॉर द ग्रैंडमदर? डिड देयर फेयर कम ट्रू? व्हाट हैपेंड टू द ग्रैंडमदर? So on the day of the return of the author, the grandmother collected the women of the neighborhood, got an old drum, and started to sing and celebrate the author's homecoming. She continued to sing for hours together. The family feared that she would fall sick due to overstraining. They persuaded her to stop, but as feared by the family, the grandmother was taken ill the next morning. It was a mild fever, and the doctor told the family that it would go, but the grandmother knew that her end was near. Since she had skipped her prayers that day, she told everyone that she would not waste any more time in talking to them and started her prayers. Even before the family could suspect, her lips stopped moving and the rosary fell from her lifeless fingers. A peaceful pallor spread on her head, on her face, and the family knew that she was dead. So, on the day of the return of the author, so grandmother ने सेलिब्रेट किया, सारे आसपास के जो women ने folk है उनको इकट्ठा किया and she started singing. So she overstrained herself और वो बीमार पड़ गई. So डॉक्टर को बुलाया गया and doctor told that it is just mild fever, वो चला जाएगा. पर ग्रैंडमदर को पता था कि that her end was near. So उस दिन क्योंकि ग्रैंडमदर ने अपने प्रेयर्स जो है फर्स्ट टाइम मिस की थी, सो ग्रैंडमदर टोल्ड एवरीवन कि वो किसी से बात नहीं करेंगी, बस वो प्रेयर करेंगी. सो बिफोर दैट फैमिली कुड सस्पेक्ट एनीथिंग, grandmother's lips they stopped moving in prayers and the rosary fell from his lifeless fingers. So the family knew that grandmother was dead. So in what odd way did grandmother behave just before she died? So it is again the same thing what had happened when author returned. So grandmother went to the station, again the same event. So she didn't look a day older to the author as usual. She didn't say anything. Her lips they were moving in prayers and she just clasped the author in her arms. So back home, she didn't miss feeding the sparrows in the afternoon, but in the evening, a change came over her. The grandmother collected the women of the neighborhood, got an old drum, started to sing and celebrate Arthur's homecoming. She continued to sing for hours together. The family feared that she would fall sick due to overstraining. They persuaded her to stop, but as feared by the family, the grandmother was taken ill the next morning. It was a mild fever, and the doctor told the family members that it would go. But the grandmother knew her end was near. Since she had skipped her prayers that day, she told everyone that she would not waste any more time talking to them and started her prayers. Even before the family could suspect, her lips stopped moving and the rosary fell from her lifeless fingers. A peaceful pallor spread on her face, and the family knew that she was dead. So, again, the same events that led to her death. So, just before what all had happened with the grandmother death led to her death. So, these are the events. So, family, so grandmother knew that she had skipped her prayers just before her end was near. Therefore, she told everyone that she is not going to talk to them anymore. So, the whole family protested. They wanted to talk to the grandmother in her last few moments, but she refused. So, grandmother started her prayers, and during her prayers, she died. So, how did the sparrows express their sorrow when the author's grandmother died? So, in the evening, when the family went to the room of grandmother to take her for cremation, they saw thousands of sparrows scattered on the floor all over the veranda and in her room, right up to where she lay dead. So, grandmother was lying dead in the room, and all the sparrows, thousands of sparrows, they were scattered on the floor all over the veranda and in a room right up to where grandmother was lying on the floor. So the sparrows, they were all quiet. There was no chirping. The author's mother fetched some bread, broke it into small pieces, and threw it to them. The birds took no notice of the bread and flew away after the grandmother's corpse was taken away. The birds too had realized that the grandmother was no more. So birds, they were just sitting quiet like this. They did not eat anything. They did not peck at any breadcrumbs. And when the grandmother's corpse was taken away, the birds too flew away from there. So birds too came to know that grandmother was no more. Now, 15th question. The author says that the common link of friendship was snapped between him and his grandmother after he got his own room. So, do you think it was end of their friendship? Discuss. It is rightly said, absence makes the heart grow fonder, but it sure makes the rest lonely. So this stands true in the case of author and his grandmother. Though the author's absence did not break the loving bond between the two, it did make the grandmother lonely. So this is a long question, so it is to be answered like this. You can write a quote that goes with the question so that your answer becomes more expressive. So now this quote here, it stands true in the case of author and grandmother, though the author's absence did not break the loving bond between the two. So even when the author was not there, they were not sharing the same room. It wasn't that the love between the two, it was no more. But the love, the bonding was there. But for grandmother, grandmother became lonely. But it sure makes the rest lonely. So this is what happened with the grandmother. So the friendship between the author and his grandmother grew in the village. Throughout the day they were together. The grandmother took care of author and even accompanied him to the school. Once in the city, though they shared the same room, they did not have anything in common. The author went to an English school on a bus, and the grandmother was not able to help him anymore in his schoolwork. The thought that no religious teachings were imparted in the school and the author's interest in music lessons made her upset. The only common link between the two, the room, was snapped when the author went to university and he was given a room of his own. The grandmother isolated herself and took to wheel spinning and feeding sparrows. Though the physical distance increased between the two, the bond of friendship and love was intact. When the author decided to go abroad, he knew his grandmother would be upset. He was worried whether he would be able to see her again, as he was going to be away for 5 years. The grandmother went to station to see him off, and the author too cherished her sweet love on his forehead. After 5 years, when the author returned, the grandmother went to receive him and celebrated his homecoming throughout the evening. Because of overstraining herself for hours together, she was taken ill the next morning and died. Thus, the friendship between the two that started in the village ended only after the death of the grandmother. So, though the distance between the two increased, there was a communication gap, but love, it was always there. The bonding was always there. So that bonding, that friendship only ended with the death of the grandmother. So, theme of the story now. The Portrait of a Lady, written by Khushwant Singh, is an autobiographical narrative about the delicate and loving bond shared by the author with his grandmother. So, the story is universal in nature, as one can relate to the changing terms between the author and his grandmother. So, this story, it is actual in not only the story of the grandmother and the author, it happens with many of us in our lives. So, though painful, it has become the reality of life. The story is an account of author's reminiscences of his days spent with his grandmother. The increasing distance between the two is quite evident as the author grows and gets busy with his activities in life. The grandmother, on the other hand, withdraws herself and takes to wheel spinning, praying, and feeding sparrows. Now, there's these expressions that are in the beginning of the chapter. So let's infer their meanings from the context. From the context means as they are used in the chapter. So the thought was almost revolting. It means that the author could not bring himself to terms with the idea that grandmother was once a child like him and played games with other children. So this thought aroused doubts in his mind. Then an expanse of pure white serenity. It refers to calm, peaceful, and contented personality of the grandmother. A turning point. It refers to the decisive change that transformed their lives. Then accepted her seclusion with resignation. So it means that remained passive. The grandmother remained passive, didn't oppose or show her dislike, just withdrew herself. कुछ नहीं बोला, कोई बात नहीं करी, बस चुप हो गई और अपने आप में समा गई. Then a veritable bedlam of chirping. It is noisy confusion that was caused by the chirping of the birds. Then frivolous rebukes means non-serious scolding. And the sagging skin of the dilapidated drum. It means loose skin of an old drum. So this is the chapter. Now we come to an important question, that is three phases of the author's relationship with his grandmother. So these three phases, again, it is the same series of events, so I'm not going to read them. You can just pause here to read if you want. I'll just tell you in brief. The first phase was the childhood phase that was spent in the village with the grandmother. So what activities were done in the village? It is that. Then the second phase started when both of them, they came to the city and author started going to the English school. So what they did there, it is that was the second phase. And third phase started when he entered university, and the common link between the two, that was the room, that was also snapped. So author got his own room and that link was snapped. So that forms the third phase in their relationship, when grandmother withdrew herself to loneliness. So these are the three phases. So as with every passing phase, so this last line is important. So with every passing phase, where on one hand the author got busy with his life, the grandmother withdrew herself into loneliness. So जैसे जैसे एक फेज से दूसरे फेज में जाता गया ऑथर, सो वैसे वैसे जो ग्रैंडमदर है वो अपने आप को पीछे करती गई. So she's kept on withdrawing herself. She kept on isolating herself from the grandson. So these are the image credits, and that's all for today. See you next time with another topic, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel because now I'll be covering total CBSE syllabus of +1. Thank you for now and keep watching.